In your third book, The Unraveling, you documented the war in CAR, Central African Republic.
Yeah.
Could you give everyone a brief about the book? Like, what's the narrative here?
Yeah, so I was asked at the end of 2012, the beginning of 2013, to start to look at the Central African Republic because I'd spent a lot of time in that country. Bizarrely enough, it's one of the most forgotten countries in Africa, never mind Central Africa. And so when Human Rights Watch called me to say that they were interested in learning a little bit more and that there were some potential challenges around rebel groups being formed, I agreed. I wanted to go and try to understand more. And then later in 2013, we went, I think mid 2013, July, August, to really, what had happened was that there was a group called Seleka, which in local language means a coalition, sort of coming together of people. And they'd been formed from lots of different backgrounds, but a lot of them from individuals that had been put into exile or challenged by the current president, Bozezi. And so, many of the clear actors, one of them was Michael Jatodia, who became the leader of the Seleka, were ex-soldiers of Bozezi, working with him in the presidential guard and working very high up in his military. And so as a result of one action or another, many of them had been put into exile, been put into jail, and had either broken out of jail or been released. And they came together in 2012, and they started to move towards Bangui, the capital of Central African Republic. And, cutting a long story short, they overthrew the government, displaced President Bozezi and his government, and took power. Interestingly enough, the Seleka at that time were made up of Muslims and Christians and animists, and there was no real focus. There was a big mix of backgrounds, religious backgrounds, in the Seleka at the time. And so what then happened with that Seleka rule? A lot of the time, if you start to recruit as a movement moves towards a city and becomes the perception of their movement becomes more promising, and that they might be successful in this mission, they tend to recruit more people. And so initially, there may be 50 people, and then there are 250 people, then there are 1,000 people, then there are 5,000 people. So the closer they get to the capital and the bigger chance of success, then more people jump on board. But of course, these people need some sort of agreement of payment at some point, and you don't have the money to pay 5,000 people. And so at some point, you have to come to an agreement of how you're going to pay these 5,000 people. And, there was, of course, money in the central bank and there's money in the government. So when they took over the central areas of Bangui, they had access to that money, or some of it. But there's not a lot there. This is Central African Republic. There are not millions and millions that are stashed there. So how do these people get paid? Very similar to the way the soldiers in Sierra Leone paid themselves in 1997 and 1998. It became this concept of Operation Pay Yourself. Because you had a vehicle and you had a weapon, then you had the means to take what you wanted from the population. And so that became the way many of these soldiers paid themselves. And they focused a lot on the Christian and animist populations. And so it started to fracture along religious lines ever so slightly. And so a lot of these individuals, because they had come from Sudan and Chad and northern parts of Central African Republic, where a large part of the Muslim population lived, a large percentage, but not everybody in the Seleka were Muslim. There were Christians there and there were animists there too, but a smaller percentage. But increasingly, these groups became fractured along these religious lines. And then the leaders of these two groups, the Seleka and the responding military movement called the Anti-Balaka, started to use religion as a tool and as a communication tool to rally both responses against the population and also troops to come and join them. And so it started to fracture along these religious lines, Muslim against Christian and animist population. But that was really a manipulated movement by the leaders of those movements. And so, for a while, Michael Jatodia and the Seleka movement controlled Bongi, and these people were attacking these rural communities and stealing food and animals and killing and raping. And of course, this created a fear amongst the local population, and they started to move outside of their homes and started to live in the bush. And that's when Human Rights Watch and I came along, and we started to document the lives of those people living in the bush as a result of running from the Seleka. And so we spent several months documenting that. And then this movement started to respond to this Seleka incursion, and that was the anti-Balaka. And the anti-Balaka were really a local militia that were in place for many, many years in Central African Republic, protecting the roads from bandits. They were a local defense force in all of the villages. And anti-Balaka stands for anti-machete, so meaning that you fight against the people that come into your villages with machetes to steal things. And so that anti-Balaka movement was formed on a national level as a response to the Seleka. And a lot of the people from Bozese's military group started to get involved in it, and they started to be financed and get better weapons. And so they started to face off against the Seleka. And in early December 2013, that came to a head, and the anti-Balaka started to move on Bongi. And then, again, a long story short, by the beginning of 2014, I think, January, February 2014, the regime of the Seleka fell. Michael Jatodi was called to Chad by Idris Deby from Chad, who is really the kingmaker of the region, the president of Chad. If you're not doing things in the right way, then Chad, because of the oil and the petrodollars that they have there, they become a very powerful force. And Michael Jatodi was asked to step down and go into exile, which he did. But that left a big vacuum of power in Bongi in the Central African Republic. And so there started to be this infighting. But also, more importantly, this population of animist and Christians that had been so oppressed for many months started to rise up and started to vent their anger and frustration against the largely innocent Muslim population that had been living peacefully for many years, decades, with the Christian population. They'd been intermarried. This is one of the communities in Africa where these two religious communities were as integrated as they could be. And so, you had families ripped apart along these religious lines, a husband going one way, wife going another, because of their religion. And so over time, this pressure that was put on the Muslim population by the civilian and sometimes organized by the anti-Balaka militarily, the pressure that the Muslim population felt started to drive them out of their homes. And then I think at the end of that process, nearly 600,000 Muslims were ethnically cleansed from Central African Republic. And again, today you have a fracture amongst northeast and southwest of Central African Republic, where southwest is predominantly Christian and animist, and northeast is predominantly Muslim. And they draw a line pretty much across the country. And whilst we see Central African Republic as a single state, it actually has two parts to it. Very similar to the way Nigeria, experienced, their secession in the 70s and 80s, and now come together. But they have this power sharing agreement between the North and the South in Nigeria. I think at some point in the future, a similar sort of solution will happen in CAR, but it's going to take a long time.